I hope you are all doing well tonight. And just to let you know, May is Mental Health Awareness Check-in. So I would like to invite you all to check in with yourselves and make sure you are meeting all of your emotional and mental and social needs during this time, especially as we are approaching near the end of the quarter and the end of spring. So keep pushing. Our year is almost finished. And this is our last Alumni Table Talk of the quarter. So I'd like to shout out Esther and Emily for joining us tonight. And I would like to introduce myself. My name is Alina Gaplu Martinez. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Cross-Cultural Center's Jim Lynn Alumni Relations and Development Intern, as well as lead social justice educator. I am majoring in human biology and sociology, and I will be facilitating tonight's event. And now I would like to invite Violetta for an introduction.
Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Violetta Gonzalez, and I'm the Assistant Director and Center Manager for the Cross-Cultural Center. I am super excited to have our past interns here today. Once an intern, always an intern. So part of the cool thing about the Alumni Roots program is the ability to get mentors like Esther and Emily. And so here they are, years later after their internship, giving back. And so we really, really appreciate your time today. Welcome.
Thank you. Always.
Yes, thank you all for joining us today. To give a little background, Alumni Table Talks is a program that started last year, created for alumni to share their personal and professional experiences with current students, and as a space for students to ask questions as they embark on their own journey. So I encourage you to put your questions in the chat if any arise, or even if you feel comfortable unmuting, you are able to do so as well. And then you can also check out our previous talks from our YouTube channel, and we will be sharing the information and QR codes to do that later. All right, it's important we give a land acknowledgement before we start our event. And even though we are virtual, the UC San Diego community holds great respect for the land and the original people of the area where our campus is located. The university is built on the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. Today, the Kumeyaay people continue to maintain their political sovereignty and cultural traditions as vital members of the San Diego community. We acknowledge their tremendous contributions to our region, and we thank them for their stewardship. And this was adapted from the UC San Diego Intertribal Resource Center. A quick overview of how our event will flow. We will start with panelist introductions. Then we will move to our roundtable discussion where I will be asking the panel some questions. But again, you can feel free to unmute or put any questions you have in the chat. And then we will finalize it with some closing statements and sharing some upcoming CCC events. Now it's time that we meet our lovely panelists and give them their introductions. So if Esther, you could start, I have it listed there on the screen, but if you could share your names, pronoun, graduation year, college and major, a little bit of what you were involved in your undergrad, and then some of your post-professional experience, and then your current role.
Yeah, of course. Hi, everybody, and thank you for being here today. My name is Esther Solis. My pronouns are she, hers. And I transferred to UCSD in 2015 and graduated with my public health degree in 2017 from Psych College. I was, I believe, the third cohort that graduated as a public health major. So I definitely had access to a lot of the new programs and a lot of the new partnerships that UCSD was developing with San Diego and all the different communities. As my time there as a transfer student, I was also an intern at the Cross-Cultural Center with the 2016 cohort, and I was one of two, my very lovely, I shared the programming intern role with another lovely intern. And that year was amazing. Outside of having that involvement with the UCSD, I also volunteered a lot with the community in the South Bay area of San Diego. I was part of a program called a Patient Health Initiative. And essentially this was a grant where it provided different types of interventions two folks in the South Bay. One of the programs that I was involved with required providing help and aid to geriatric patients who usually lived alone and, you know, needed a little bit of like a check-in to make sure that they had their basic needs met. And the other program that I also was heavily involved with required a health education component on how to prevent high blood pressure in the community there. So after going through those different experiences, I realized that I really liked, you know, from my experience at the Cross-Cultural Center, I loved programming. I loved getting, you know, information together to bring to people and for people to come and really have an environment where they can learn something different and feel empowered. I eventually, as part of my major, had to do an internship, and that's where I, you know, got into the field of research. Aside of liking to be organizing programs and events, I also thrive on understanding data. I feel like data for me gives me a lot of answers to things that I, you know, patterns that I may see, but I also can pinpoint where they are coming from. So part of that job is what led me to what I'm doing now. I work at a research lab at Brown University, where we are essentially figuring out whether an intervention for Latina women is effective in allowing them to feel empowered to build habits and really increase their physical activity and maintain it. So a lot of the things that I do there as a research assistant is not only gather, you know, data, but also I do a lot of motivational interviewing and conduct these sessions with the Latinas to really figure out what are some of the barriers that they encounter in, you know, their daily routines that prevent them from building these healthier habits. Aside of that, you know, I've always loved volunteering for things outside of work. So I volunteered at different community health centers that provide care for the undocumented community here in Providence, Rhode Island. And through that experience, I was able to become a certified medical interpreter. So that truly has opened a lot of doors for me here in Rhode Island in just the networking that I've done, but also in figuring out what I want to do with my career moving forward.
Okay, I'll go. I also live outside a very noisy street with like a train track. So please let me know if you can't hear me at any point because of that. It's past rush hour now, so it should be better than usual. But my name is Emily. I use she, her pronouns. I graduated in 2019 from Thurgood Marshall College, and I double majored in ethnic studies and psychology. During my time at UCSD, I was involved with Students Against Mass Incarceration. I led the org for a couple years, and we worked with a grassroots organization in LA called the California Coalition for Women Prisoners to get resources and support to women and queer folks who were in prison. We also did on-campus political education about mass incarceration in the prison industrial complex. And I was also an intern at the Women's Center and also the Cross-Cultural Center. I was the affiliates and leadership intern during the 2018 to 2019 academic year. It was one of the most wonderful experiences I had as an undergrad. And I learned a lot of skills there that have helped me through my career development up till now. So very, very grateful and very happy to be here. I am finishing up a master's program at Columbia University in mental health counseling. It was a 2-year program, and the program just ended. This was the end of my second year. This year, I have been taking classes as well as doing field work. So my program has an experiential learning component, which means that in addition to our academic courses, we also have to work in a community mental health setting, school, hospital, or private practice to gain hands-on experience doing therapy. And so I'll talk more about the train is coming. I'll talk more about my experiences in my internship later on in the panel, but to give a brief overview, I work with folks who are in the New York shelter system and provide them with individual therapy. And then I am starting a new role in the coming fall at a private practice in Chicago, where I'll be giving remote therapy services, and starting out with individual, but also learning to give group therapy, couples therapy, and family therapy as well. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. Like Esther, I also really love volunteering outside of work as well. I just moved to New York like last year during the pandemic, so I haven't gotten to really explore local organizations here, but this coming summer, once I'm out of school fully, I want to dedicate myself to doing that, because the CCC has taught me the importance of community care. So that's something that I want to carry on in my professional career as well. That's me.
Thank you both for those great introductions. It was a great segue into our roundtable. And so I just want to give a reminder, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask, put them in the chat or even unmute. I'm going to take down my screen now so we can see everybody. And I'm pulling up my questions. All right, so for our first one, this is for both of you. What led you to your first post-undergrad position? And then I see that you both went to the East Coast. Was this right after your UCSD? I know you went over it a little bit, but it was just already set.
Esther, do you want to go first?
Wow. Yeah, I'm just like, I've been reflecting a lot on like what I did after UCSD, and I didn't come right away. I stayed in San Diego for a year and a half. I came here March 2019. And you know what, right when I graduated from with my public health degree, I was really interested in becoming a community health worker, specifically in the City Heights area in San Diego, with a clinic. And that job was something that I was really interested in. It was a great opportunity, but the pay, you know, when you try to, you know, really be involved with nonprofits, sometimes the pay is not the best, or the benefits. And I just wasn't at a position where I could really not think of myself in that way, because I was becoming independent, right? Like San Diego is expensive. So I was like, I need to really look for a job where I can be self-sustainable and just make it. So from the internship that I was participating in, I, you know, networked, and, you know, a lot of the principal investigators saw my work and they were interested. And I actually went back and asked if there was any positions open for any of the research studies, and there was. So I decided to apply for it, and fortunately I was able to get it. So I was working again in a research study based on physical activity for Latina women based in San Diego. During that year, you know, with research studies, they definitely aren't, it's not a job that is the same, because they evolved based on the grant year, right? So that study was actually coming to an end. We were working mostly on wrapping up, you know, the intervention with those participants, doing data entry. Since I already had a little bit of experience with a lot of the assessment part of the research, I was asked if I wanted to come to Providence to train the staff on a sister study that one of the PIs had here. So I said, hey, it's a free trip to the East Coast. Of course, because in my head, I'm like, I'm going to New York after, you know, because it's like right here. And sure enough, I came, and, you know, through the training, I realized that the parent study, sister study here was definitely not up to par. There was a lot of things that needed adjustments. And after, you know, communicating that with the project managers and principal investigators, they actually asked me if I ever thought about moving to the East Coast. And I said no, because I don't know anybody here. There's no family here. Like you know, San Diego is 2 hours away from LA. That's where all my family is. And I was very comfortable. But essentially, I remember they offered me to, you know, come here. Brown University it reimburses you for, you know, any travel that you do to move from out of state to work there. And also I was offered a better, salary and other perks. So in reality, I thought about it really hard. I remember even having conversations, with a lot of my mentors from UCSD, and I didn't know, should I leave my comfort zone in California? Should I come to a state where I don't know anybody? And, and eventually I took the leap and I got here 2019, and I became very, very homesick because obviously it was like a culture shock. I don't know if for you, Emily, you see the difference between East Coast and West Coast, but it was definitely culture shock. But being involved in my work, volunteering at the clinic also helped me get to know community here. So that was something that really, I would say, propelled me to stay here. And obviously the pandemic was coming around the corner in 2020. So at that point, I was like, I wanted to go back to the West Coast with my family, but I was like, nobody's hiring. Grants stopped, funding stopped for a lot of universities. So I had a set job here. I was able to, because our intervention is web-based, for us, it didn't really hit us as hard. We could still continue the research online. And 2020 happened, 2021, it was, okay, we're still online, but we can do some things in person. So it's definitely been a journey for me. I didn't come straight out of, after graduating. I had to go through a lot of personal growth, I think, to feel comfortable. But yeah, that's how I came to be here and my journey here.
That's an amazing story. I had a sort of weird journey here. I also took a gap year after graduating, and during that time, I did a lot of volunteering work. I interned at the San Diego Asian Film Festival, which was another amazing experience. And that actually helped me sort of hone my interest in becoming a therapist, because I learned there that I was really in love with people and listening to their stories. And that pretty naturally leads into being a therapist, because that's all you do as a therapist, just work with people and listen to their stories. So I did that. I worked as a research assistant at the Language and Development Lab at UCSD for a couple years. Even after I had gotten into grad school, I was still working there. That was a good experience because it taught me that I didn't want to do psychology research. I also did a research assistantship at Harvard, which was completely virtual, which was very interesting. But that also, again, reaffirmed that I didn't want to be a researcher in psychology. And so I had to figure out what I wanted to do if I didn't want to do research, and it was to become a therapist. And so in October of 2020, I started applying. Well, first I took the GRE. I got a better score than I expected that I was going to get. And so I was like, okay, I'm just going to apply to all the counseling programs in the country that sound interesting to me, and have good resources, and are good schools. And so I applied to a bunch. I was accepted to some. I was accepted to all of them, not to toot my own horn, but I was accepted to all of them. And so I had a bunch of choices. And I started going to visit them in the spring of 2021. I feel like I'm getting my timeline wrong. I think I started visiting in the spring of 2020 because that was before the pandemic hit. So I started applying in October of 2019. COVID years are just a blur, but I think that's the correct timeline. So I didn't actually get to visit all of the grad schools I applied to because of the pandemic. I only got to visit one that was in Boston. And I liked it okay, but there were other options that I wanted more. And shortly after that, everything shut down. And I flew back to San Diego, and I was living with a couple of close friends at the time. And I heard from Columbia that they had accepted me. And I was like, I didn't think that they were going to accept me. I really liked the sound of the program, and they really emphasize studying how to provide counseling to people who have been underserved by psychology, so namely people of color, queer folks, immigrants. And that was something that was really important to me, and still is very important to me. And that's the kind of therapy that I wanted to practice. And so it seemed like my interests aligned with the curriculum that they offered. I talked with a grad student from the program, and I ended up deciding to accept their offer. I had a couple close friends in New York already. So when I moved here last winter to sort of get acclimated to my surroundings before starting to work here and go to school here, I did feel homesick. I moved in the middle of winter, so I definitely missed San Diego at that point. But luckily I had one close friend that I've known since high school who lives here, so that helped a lot. But it's definitely different. And I've grown up a lot here. And it's been difficult to be here during the pandemic, I think. But one other thing I wanted to say about grad school is that when I was deciding to come to this program, I got really good advice from one of my mentors who actually worked at the Language and Development Lab at UCSD. And she said that choosing a grad school should be just as much an emotional decision as an intellectual one, meaning that it should match with your research and career interests just as much as it is a place you want to live, and a program that has people that you relate to and can see yourself like being a mentee of or being friends with. That's really important. So yeah, that's how I ended up here.
Thank you for both sharing. I think I wanted to definitely highlight your experiences about like transitions. Like, I know I'm going to find myself in a transition soon, so I just wanted to see how you navigated that, and especially from, like you're saying, it's a culture shock going from one end of a country to the other. I'm sure it's very different. And now I'm going to ask for you to think a little bit more back to your undergrad, and how did you decide on your major? For Esther, I know, like you said, you were one of the first to experience a public health major at UCSD. If you could explain this experience. And for Emily, I saw you completed both ethnic studies and psychology. What made you complete these together?
I think that when I was at community college, I really thought that I wanted to be a journalist. I love writing. So I started off, doing a lot of journalism classes. I actually got an associate's in communication because I was taking so many communication classes. But there was a point where I realized, there's just, media can be so controlled. And at that point, I got discouraged, and I was like, I just want to do something that really is gonna make me feel like my career is making an impact. At that point, I was working at a geriatric nursing home. And like I said, I'm a person that sees patterns. So I was realizing that a lot of, the patients that I worked with were of certain demographics and certain socioeconomic backgrounds. And I just didn't understand, why folks who have worked their butts off, in society, get to be in a place where their quality of life is not the best. And I just didn't understand that. When I was in community college, I ended up changing my major to biology because I said, you know what, I want to be a doctor, and I want to make sure that I connect with my patients, because that's something I also heard from, a lot of people in the nursing home, is that they never really had that connection because they never really trusted, their doctors or where they went to go get care. And I was like, you know what, I first of all, I loved anything, related to the body. That outside of, writing, I think for me to learn how the body works has always been interesting. And I was like, I think I can connect writing with, medicine, because I can also write about, how to better take care of yourself, how to, create certain types of, health education materials for people to be aware and for them to be accessible. So that was one of like my main focuses. And when I went to UCSD, I knew it was a fairly new program. And that's why I was attracted to the school in the first place, was because I knew that professors would be there to essentially give you a view of what the public health world is. I was also very attracted when I took my first public health class at the concept of preventative medicine. And that to me was like, kind of like, okay, like, yeah, let's prevent like getting to these diseases that make us not feel good or make our quality of life, horrible. And UCSD, when I remember going to Triton Day, and all the public health professors were accessible to talk after their presentations. And that's because there wasn't that many students. And I was like, you know what? I like this. I'm a very personal, like I like person-to-person interaction. That's why this pandemic has been like horrible for me, because, I can't feel people's vibes from, the computer sometimes. And having that access to those professors was super helpful. As an undergrad, I participated in the practicum, and the practicum was basically a whole semester. We focused on a public health issue, and for me it was health literacy. And I created materials that were accessible to read, to the folks that attended English as a second language class in Linda Vista. So, doing assessment, figuring out what reading levels they were at, making sure that we had a lot of materials in the books that allowed them to know, okay, like these are the guidelines for nutrition, for physical activity, and I know what to do with that. Because sometimes you go to the doctor and they'll be like, oh yeah, like you're gonna take 3 ibuprofens, and at the end of the day, they'll ask you, what medications are you on? And people are like, what's an ibuprofen? What's Tylenol? It's pain medication, So that was important to me, and that's what I focused on, as an undergrad at UCSD. But essentially, even now, I'm still pursuing, going to medical school. But for me, my journey, I can't say it's been like a straight path. I mean, I've gone, like, I'm a, community health worker as well. I got certified in that because I had to learn how to give, health education courses to people with diabetes, people with that have heart attacks. With medicine, it's very, because there's so many protocols, you have to be certified. And I think that's something that I want to take when I go into medical school, not to forget why I'm doing it. A lot of the times I think, you focus on the hard sciences, you focus on what research you want to do as a doctor. And I never want to leave behind the fact that I always want to stay connected to community. I want to know what's going on, in the communities. And since they shift all the time, I like public health for that reason, because public health acknowledges that, we're in a community, and that community may have these, health problems, disparities, but with time, things can shift. And I love applying that to also the hard sciences. So yeah, that's how I came to my major, and also how I kind of navigate, how I will move forward with my career.
Esther, that was a great answer, and I resonated a lot with what you said. I also definitely did not have a straight path, and I still am thinking about like what I want to do 5 to 10 years from now. I don't see myself as like a one career for the rest of my life kind of person. And in fact, something that I've learned in grad school while training to be a therapist is that most therapists burn out in 10 years because it's so much work, emotional work, to listen to people day after day, hear about trauma and hear about pain and carry all of that with you. And so a lot of people, after they've worked as therapists for 10 years, end up choosing a different but maybe related career path. So a lot of my professors actually started out with a private practice or started out in a community mental health setting, and after like years and years of working in those positions decided they wanted to be a teacher. And some of them still have practices on the side, some of them do consulting, but something that I have learned is really important is to think about my life and my changing needs and my changing dreams for my future, and sort of like keeping myself up to date with what I want to do. Anyway, that was a little bit of a tangent. I got interested in ethnic studies and psychology. I want to start this differently. So I became interested in psychology, at least partly because I saw my grandmother struggle with what would probably be diagnosed as clinical depression, but was not, because my family, as a Chinese immigrant family, didn't use that language to talk about what she was going through. And she was very sad for a long time, and my parents eventually connected her with a local church where they live in Illinois. And she ended up hanging out with some other Chinese immigrant folks at this church, and her depression got better. And that was a very interesting experience for me as a 17 or 18-year-old at the time, because she didn't go to what would be considered traditional talk therapy, which is what I'm trained to do, but she still sort of got better. And that made me really interested in the tenuous relationship that Asian American and Asian communities, and also other marginalized communities as well, have to psychology. It made me question what mental health as a concept was. And it also made me want to be someone that could have helped someone like my grandmother when she was in pain. And so that's what made me interested in psych. I actually started out as pre-med. I was in human bio, and then my second year I took half a semester of, or quarter, it's quarter systems at UCSD, I forget that. I took half a quarter of OChem, and I was like, I cannot do this. And then I switched my major to psych. And I had a close friend who was in ethnic studies who talked to me about her classes, and I was like, wow, this is really cool. Like, this is stuff that I think about on my own time. Like, I think a lot about race and power relations between people. And I want to study this. So I started taking classes, and psychology was my main major, but I like to say that ethnic studies was like the foundation, like the backbone upon which all of my education was based, because I learned to see the theories that I was learning about in psychology through the critical lens that ethnic studies gave me. Like, a really popular one is like Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like, people need food, shelter, and safety before they can start to self-actualize, right? And I learned to apply like an ethnic studies lens to that theory, which an example would be like, well, who has the resources to get their basic needs met, and why do different communities have barriers to those basic resources that prevent them from self-actualizing? So yeah, that was how I came to major in both. And I still try to keep that balance in my day-to-day work now. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's actually perfect for our next question that leads right into it. How does social justice play a role in the work you do now? And how do you connect mental health with social justice?
social justice and mental health is huge, I think. I think that when because you think, and I know like when I've gone to different talks about medicine and different treatments that there are for like diabetes or physical, things that happen to your body physically, physiologically, you can be very factual, but when it comes to mental health and behaviors and things like that, there's so much you have to take into account, and there's so many layers and so much thing you have to really incorporate. For me in my job, behavioral health research, there's always going to be, data that's numerical, and it's going to give you this person did 60 minutes of walking, and that's how you're going to analyze, right? 60 minutes. But when I go and do the motivational interviews with the participants, that's part of their intervention, a component that we do every 6 months to figure out, is the website working? Are all the materials that we put on the website for them to kind of read and educate themselves and feel empowered, are they being effective or not? I realized that the motivational interview becomes, in a way, kind of like a therapy session. And I was actually trained by a clinical psychologist. So when she trained me, she really, taught me that concept of making sure that you give them space to breathe and really like connect with themselves and tell you how they're feeling and tell you how they see themselves, at that moment. It could be that they're super motivated, that they're, they've been super effective at keeping their physical activity and they feel great. But you also have the opposite spectrum where people go through stuff, like a lot of Latinas that participate in our study are, they go to our study because they really don't have access to go to the gym and get a personal trainer. That's super expensive. Their moms, they want to know what's accessible. A website, yeah, like I can do that, on my free time at home. So a lot of those, you start seeing how their socio demographics and all of those things affect their success rates. And for me, even though we don't use, our sessions to come to terms with whether our intervention was effective, is something we talk, on our weekly meetings. Anytime, there's situations that happen. For example, if somebody got mugged while they went for a walk and they tell me that, we have to talk about it as a team, because essentially, this person is using our recommendations to go walk around their neighborhood, which, it might not be the safest neighborhood for somebody to go walk, or they go at night. And when that happens, we have to navigate how to provide the best feedback for them, and also how to make our intervention function in the different types of settings that our participants can be in. So, through that, I think that I feel like just having access to talking to somebody, and not only, anybody, but talking to me in their language, in their native language, like everything's in Spanish. So for them to, I remember when I first started doing those interviews, they're like, they tell me in Spanish, oh, you know what I'm talking about, right? And I'm like, yeah, I know that novela too. Like, like I'm familiar not only with like the language, but the culture, like, like, because I grew up speaking Spanish at my house. And so all of that really helped me connect with them, like even them telling me like, oh yeah, in the pandemic, how we like to have our little champurrado at night, which is like a kind of like a hot chocolate drink. I'm like, I know, because I love to have it too, So essentially, I think that's a component that it's a lot of the times missing. And you can see it in the statistics, right? Like people who graduate as doctors, as therapists, majority of especially women, are white women. So women of color who are in these fields is what's missing. And I think sometimes that in itself, prevents people from actually achieving and feeling comfortable and take advantage of the whole session or the whole intervention or therapy session that they go to. So yeah, I think, mental health is just having access to it and making sure it's something that is actually appropriate for the person who goes to get those resources.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I also think that as a therapist, I have the authority to sort of say, like, this is what mental wellness looks like. And that version of mental wellness is usually very tied up with whiteness, with ability status, with socioeconomic status. And so that's something that I try to keep in mind in my work too, that someone's wellness is not going to look like one standard. Different people from different communities, from different backgrounds, who have different life circumstances are going to have different levels of wellness or different versions of wellness. And this is especially relevant to my work because, as I was saying before, I was doing field work this year with folks who were living in the New York shelter system. So they were homeless or had been homeless and now live in supportive housing. So my day-to-day work would be visiting folks at their shelter or visiting them at their supportive housing unit, which usually was an apartment that they lived in by themselves or with a roommate, and providing counseling to them. But it also looked like sitting with them, applying for Social Security benefits, applying for housing, applying for jobs. And in this experience, I saw firsthand how a person's mental wellness is tied up with how well they're able to access resources. Like if a person who doesn't have a place to live is depressed, their depression is definitely connected to them not having a place to live. And when I worked with clients who were living in a shelter, they didn't really want to talk to me about their trauma or their feelings. They wanted housing. So my job as their therapist was to provide them with that resource, or try my best to connect them with that resource so that they could take the first step to getting well. It wasn't to sort of impose my own idea of what therapy should look like onto them, because that wouldn't have been helpful to them. Yeah. I wrote down a few things that I wanted to say for this question, so I'm checking my notes, but I think that's it. I think when we talk about mental health, we always have to talk about that person's access to resources, their identities, and the specific intersections they exist at, and how that enables them or disables them from having access to resources, because that's going to feed into how well they're able to take care of themselves and how well they're able to keep themselves safe or keep their loved ones safe. So that's definitely something that I think about, having worked with folks in the shelter system this year and also going into private practice. By going to private practice, I'm necessarily going to be serving people who are able to pay for therapy for the most part, either that or they have insurance, which is not the case for the clients that I had this past year. But going into private practice also means starting to think about how accessible or not my practice is to other people. And most therapists will try to provide sliding scale services, as well as pro bono services, so completely free of charge for people who need it. But then you also have to think about what that means for your own well-being. As a therapist, my income is going to be made from providing therapy to people and them paying me for it. And so I'm going to have to be thinking very seriously this upcoming year about how I want to weave that social justice into my work, because I need to, like Esther was saying earlier, I need to be able to sustain myself, but I also want to be able to give back to other people. And therapy, I didn't know this coming into this field, but therapy is something that is really going to challenge me in that regard, like looking out for myself, but also looking out for others.
Absolutely. Emily, I think you're right on point when you say that when these resources exist, they're in the community, but they're not there like a long term. There's not a structure in our society that's like, okay, like, if we had a universal, law that says people have access to all their basic needs, and then from there, like whether they thrive or not, things that pop up, we'll figure out what other programs to make. There's none of that. We live in a capitalist society, so they work through these concepts, and I've seen that, and in research it's the same. We're there, and I'm there as doing this research and as their interventionist, but I'm only there with them for 2 years while they're in the program. So what happens after, it's something that I always think about. It's like, I hope they're good. I hope they feel empowered. And that's just, kind of like my framework. It's like, I'm here to like empower you to really be able to say, you know what, even if I'm not like active, 150 minutes a week, I feel like I can at any time, go back to it or do the best I can. But it's tough. It's tough to think about those two components existing.
Yeah, very true. And I think the pandemic definitely taught us that these structures are not in place, and have taught us that maybe we should be reliant more on community care and community-based solutions. Those could be the potential answers. And then something you said, Esther, really resonated with me about missing women in color in these medical settings. And I just want to commend you both for being that representation in these spaces. And this leads us into our next question. Have you experienced any imposter syndrome in your current position? How did you navigate this? Or like maybe what's something you wish you knew before you were in your current role?
I made a face when you asked that because look, walking into an Ivy League, I was just like, what? I mean, I grew up, working class parents, neighborhood. It was cool. I had a great, time growing up, but you see people walking around with their little Fendi purses, and like I was like, whoa, like I haven't seen those brands, like around me. And that's just what brown looked like to me. And it's like a lot of these very like privileged conversations that I heard around. And I'm like, oh, it must be great to just, just be able to not care how much you spend on food because you don't have a budget. You have a credit card. And yeah, so that definitely put me into a position where I was like, oh gosh, like even professionally, I felt that maybe I'm not gonna make it because, and that's what imposter syndrome is. It's like you lose track of like what your skills are, what your gifts are. And I think for me, it definitely happened. And I definitely had to kind of come back to community. I had to connect with community here. I was like, I need to know and understand why I'm here. When I moved here, I lived in a part of Providence that was very, close to brown, so like wealthy. So even, that being in that environment, I was like, there's no Latinos here. Like I thought this is a study for Latinas. Like I don't see any. I go to the stores, there's no hot sauce. Like nothing was around me. So I really was so confused. But it wasn't until I like expanded my knowledge, right? Like, and it all came through my participants. They would be like, oh, you're Mexicans, because here there's a lot of different like people that are Latinos. There's Caribbean people from the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, from Central America. And they'll be like, oh, you're Mexican. I can tell from your accent. And I'm like, yeah. And they'll tell me where to go get the tacos, like just feeling connected and coming back to myself. I was like, okay, cool. Like, yes, like there is a space here for me. Because, when you come and you see a world that's so different that I've never felt comfortable around rich people, unfortunately. So it really does put me back into that like not so happy place where I doubt myself. And I'm still here, in my position. I actually, was able to accomplish other things through it. So I'm like, yeah, I definitely am meant to be here. it might be a little shocker for people to see somebody with like, you know, brown eyes, brown hair. You get the looks, but you know, I mean, there's nothing I can do about it. My office was definitely, I think I was the second Latina to be in my office when I came here. So definitely, if I can give anybody advice, if they experience that, is look for what makes you you and what fills your soul and what can makes you connect to your identities. And, you know, just know that you're there and that you're more than right to be there and to take up space. And, you know, it's cool when you think about how you disturb certain, you know, patterns and spaces.
That was an awesome answer yet again. Thank you for sharing, Esther. I definitely felt imposter syndrome. And what helped me was finding mentors and finding friends in my program, which was hard to do in a pandemic, but I felt very lucky that I was able to do that. And I came into this program very excited that this was going to be a place where I could learn about therapy for communities other than rich white folks. And if you don't know much about Columbia, it's a predominantly white institution. It's an Ivy League school, and the curriculum reflects that. And so I spent a lot of my past year, after my first year here, feeling like I had chosen the wrong program and feeling like I wasn't learning the skills that I wanted to learn, because the courses that I was taking were geared towards getting us to learn therapy that could only be used in private practice. And that was really disappointing to me. And I ended up choosing a fieldwork site that taught me the opposite skill set. You know, it taught me to work with people who were really underserved by mental health and social services. And so I ended up gaining a lot of the skills that I felt like I wasn't gaining at my university through my own fieldwork. And I had friends who shared my frustrations with my program that I could talk to about it. And we shared resources about therapy for immigrants, therapy for queer folks in our own time. And I felt like I really wanted to leave this program halfway through it. And what got me through it really was the people around me. It was really difficult to sort of follow through with what I had signed myself up for. I think learning online also made it a little more difficult just because there's that distance between you and like the rest of the people you're going to school with, supposedly. I ended up having a few in-person classes here and there this year, but everything else for the most part was virtual. That made it hard too. But anyway, I ended up choosing to go into private practice, knowing that it would automatically make my practice a little more exclusionary than working in a community mental health setting, because I felt like I needed the supervision, and I needed to work in a place that had resources, where I could build up my clientele and get paid and get trained well, so that I could ultimately serve the communities that I want to serve on my own. And so I see my job that I'm starting in the fall as a way for me to give back to myself, sort of give myself the training and the education that I feel like I didn't really get from my program, so that in the future I can find a way to do the work that I really want to do. And that's the cool thing about therapy, is that there's a lot of room, there's a lot of wiggle room. There's a lot of different settings that you can work with. You can work in a university, you can work in a hospital, a community mental health setting, so usually nonprofit or private practice. And I've chosen to go the private practice route. And I am very excited for the things that it's going to teach me. So yeah.
Thank you both for sharing, and that will be the end of our questions for tonight. I am going to go ahead and reshare my screen so we can close up our program. I just want to give a huge thank you to our panelists for dedicating their time and giving such an open and honest conversation. I think you provided excellent insight, navigating mental health and social justice and sharing the work that you're doing. And I love that you're disrupting spaces that weren't created for us in the first place, but you're still going strong and getting the work done. I appreciate it. And so here on the screen, we have our social media and how to connect with the Alumni Roots program. I'm sharing our email right there, and then also our link tree, which you can scan the QR code there on the right. Also, there is the link to connect to our Facebook Hug Network. This is where our students and alumni are bridged together. And then also, if you search up that group in LinkedIn, you can join our network there.